So today is June 16th, 2021. My name is Maria Saldana, and I'm here with Wendolyn Perez. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Can you start by telling me when and where you were born?
I was born in Lima, Peru in June 9th of 1994.
June 9th. So your birthday just passed.
It just passed, and I'm also a Gemini.
Nice.
I know my whole astrological chart because my mom doesn't want me to tell me my birthday, so I don't do those things. Whenever I asked her, I was like, Mom, when's my birthday? Like time, like specific time. She was like, Why? Why do you want to know? And I was like, Mom.
Okay, so, well, happy belated birthday, one.
Thank you.
And where did you grow up?
So I grew up, my first 6 years are in Peru. And then I came here, my family migrated here when I was about to turn 7. So during spring break, I specifically remember it was during spring break. And then I've been not in South Florida, but I've been like south of the United States majority of my whole life now until my 27th birthday.
Nice. Okay, so and where did your family first migrate to?
My family first migrated to Miami.
To Miami. And then you said that you've been mainly in like the south of the United States.
Mainly South Florida, but as I became an adult, I lived in a couple of different states. Yeah.
Okay. And where are you currently?
I am currently in South Florida. I am in Broward County.
And where is your family from?
So from both my parents, we all come from Peru, right? The nation state of Peru. But specifically my father, I know from him we're like up north Peru. I never get quite a specific area, right? We're always told Lima, Lima, until you really dig in and you're like, I don't think so. Well, on my mother's side, for example, I know that we're from Tauca, which is a village up in the mountains. And that's where my grandmother was born and my grandfather was born in Lima, but his family comes from Tauca. And then they come down from the mountains to Lima. So just a generation of like migration over and over again.
Yeah. So your mother's family, you said, is from Tauca?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure that I have that. And then your father, mainly Lima, but there's some like family.
But he's not from Lima. He comes from someplace else, another poor region, because both of my parents' sides come to Lima during las invasiones.
Okay.
That's how we get there. Do you need me to define invasiones?
Yeah, please.
So invasiones is something that happens in the 60s and the 70s. It still happens to this day, but it was prevalent in that time period, where, as the New York Times would define us, we were we were poor Indian peasants, right? Who come down from the mountains or impoverished areas and were trying to acquire land or a place to live in the city, which is where most jobs were at the time period. And so my grandparents come to Lima, and through fighting with police, are able to acquire land, which they paid for. And this is where we have our family homes in Lima.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for defining that for me, and for the clarification, because I think that often what I hear when I talk to Peruvian folks is similar storylines of, my family says Lima, but but they know that there's a deeper history there. So I'm really grateful that you shared that with me. Would you share a little bit about your relationship to your Peruvian identity?
So my Peruvian identity has been really complicated, right? And the reason for that is because even as Peruvians here in the United States, the identity that has formed here is not the same identity that has formed in Peru, right? So what is to be Peruvian in Peru is different to be Peruvian in the United States, because here our cultures mix with other cultures as well, not just American culture. I grew up surrounded by cousins from my mother's side, just my mother's side. My father's side is all in Peru. And what really creates sort of this division in my family. It's my mom's as well, Christianism, right? So that separates us a little bit. And so I grew up very in this weird culture where like I was Peruvian and I ate Peruvian food and I knew Peruvian culture, the holidays, the traditions. But then at the same time, it's more of like a generalistic Peruvian culture, not like what is Tauca, like, right? Like, for example, this year is the first time I'm going to celebrate El Dia de los Muertos. We make muñecas de pan. And what's it called? We put pictures out of our loved ones who have passed, and we do this, like we make tamales, and we do this whole thing. And this is a part of Peruvian culture that's really not mainstream, right? Because I'm sure you know this. A lot of the Peruvian culture that's talked about here is the Lima, is the coastal one, not Andes, not from la selva.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think what you were getting at also is that you touched on the differences of what it's like to have a Peruvian identity in Peru versus having one in the States, right? So, like being outside of Peru, you grow up with this, I think, notion of Peruvian culture, and yet it still exists outside of the country, right? The nation. And so, is it meaningful for you to have a relationship to Peru or to your Peruvian identity?
Oh, of course. I think, and the part to add to this as well is that I don't think I have grown close to my Peruvian identity, what that means, till I became documented, right? When I was undocumented, I really didn't have time to have these questions about who I was and what I was meant to do or be. And I think my sisters, for example, got closer to their identity when they had children as well, right? So, for example, for me, my identity came when I became documented. I began to ask these questions. I was like, okay, so you're telling me stories about home, because the word invasiones would always come up. But I would be like, okay, but what does that mean? And it wasn't until I was like 21 where my parents were like, oh, this is what it means. So then I was like, okay, so what you're saying is that this didn't happen. And it led me to really go into discover who I am, who my family is, and to my native language, right? Because I identify not only as Peruvian, but as Quechua.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it sounds like as you were sharing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like your priorities shift a little bit, right? You were saying that you didn't have time to think of these questions relating, Peru or your Peruvian identity until you became documented. And I think also, I often find that it's labor to have these questions, and then like what it is to like then go seek these answers. You were saying that your family would share about these invasiones, and yet the meaning wasn't always there, right? It was like a stated fact. And so I want to also acknowledge that the labor that it takes to ask these questions in order to become closer to any identity, right? But I think in this context, to your Peruvian identity. And then you sharing, that you also identify as Quechua. And so how do you maintain your relationship with Peru or your Peruvian identity or your Quechua identity?
I think it's through little activities, right? For example, I tried to learn Quechua last year. The years blur by during this pandemic. I'm like, what is last year? But what's it called? I took like an introductory class, and then I have books, and I listen to Quechua songs when I can. And with this election that's currently going on, it's been really hard to also to not separate yourself, right? Like I spend so much of my time being involved in Peruvian memes and Peru cultures and conversations, and part of like the memes and other people who are actually in Peru, and you get to actually talk to them and kind of figure it out. And I think what I try to do a little bit every day is focus back, right? Because the goal is kind of like, how to explain? I think we've been taught we leave our country and we come here and that's it. Here we start fresh and we move on. But I think lately, and perhaps I'm generalizing, but from the Peruvians I hang out with, there's sort of been a shift where we can be both. We can have a footing here and a footing in Peru, regardless of whether we spend majority of our lives here or not. if we're allowed to vote in these elections, why don't we get to also have a say in what happens in our country in these conversations about the policies that have happened?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you for naming that. The shift that you named in sort of this notion of like, we get to this country that's not Peru, and we get to start fresh, and instead and I've also seen it, right, a shift happening that where there's a lot of this want, I think, of being more in tune with Peru and what's going on in the country. These elections have like taken up so much space, I feel, in my brain, like emotionally as well, right? Because like there are memes, and I think there's ways that like folks in Peru and also outside of Peru are trying to like, like keep the humor alive.
Yes. And I think something that's really interesting about these elections that has come about is that you find yourself now with these children who are like, for example, like us, right, came here when we were so little, and the actions our parents took, right, and whether those decisions are regarding this election, and how now we as children who've heard everything from what's happened in our country in the 80s and 90s get to sort of also take a stand and say, okay, but let's think of this critically, right? And that's also a privilege to be able to sit here and be like, what happened because you say it did, or what were the other actions that happened in place? And that's also a very, very interesting thing for me to be like 27 and to be able to sit down with my father and say, well, no, like if we look at this, clearly it didn't happen this way. Like you taught me these things, but now I'm seeing it different. And it's also really interesting when usually whatever happened back home, it's what my parents say, and that's it, right? Like, oh, we left because of this is what happened, this is because of this. When you grow up and then realize, maybe not. Spice cake.
Yeah, right. And it's also so interesting, I feel, as you're saying, you get to now have these conversations, as a grown person, right, as this adult, who has grown up hearing all the stories from, parents, family. And I think that like, like I'm going to say that there's trauma there, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely trauma informing this, and it's a valid thing. And like you named, right, it's also a privilege for us to be able to listen to the stories and now have these conversations and take a stand, I feel, right? I agree with you in that sense. And so I'm curious what it feels like to be able to engage in these conversations with your family. You said you're engaging in these conversations with your father, right, regarding elections.
And my cousins too. And it's really funny because like, I think to me, it's a very frustrating thing, right? Because how to explain this? And I was like, so we're taught, we come here, right? We have, and here we start fresh, and this is the American dream, and we believe that things are going to be equal. And obviously in the past couple of years and through all of this creation, we've seen that we're not equal here, and we have to fight for our stands, right? And what's really peculiar to me through talking to people has been the fact that certain policies that we think are good in the United States are not good back home for the same like antiquated issues that we find ourselves here, right? Like issues with race, right? Or issues with indigeneity, or issues with gender and sex and what's it called. So it's really interesting to have these conversations with my father or with my cousins. My father being a person who, he's not sexist in many ways. He's sexist in that kind of like weird nurturing way where it's more to be good for you, but he's not like, he doesn't think that I can't do anything. He thinks I can do everything. Like I can set my mind to, right? But it's more of the aspect of like, I'm an adult now too. And I know that these things happened before I was born or when I was very little, and that's why we came here. But I can also have educated decisions and make educated guesses and make, references, right? And I think what this generation of Peruvians also has is the fact that we actually look back, because a lot of people don't. Once it happened, once they fled, they just refuse to look back because of the trauma, like you said, right? It's very hard to want to reopen those wounds. So that's why sometimes even the conversations we've had, like the fact that I can talk to my parents very freely about what's happened has also been like a work, like we're talking about 6 to 7 years, because they just wouldn't want to talk about it, or they said, no, don't worry about it. Like, why are you bringing up the past? And not just in the politics of our countries, but also like in our own family history, like personal things that happened to us in Peru that my parents weren't even comfortable mentioning till much later on, until all of us now, all four kids of us have become adults. And we can sort of say, well, we want to talk about it. We want to revisit this memory that we only have snippets of, but you have the whole story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's as you're sharing, it's also like it brings up almost like this emotional response even in me, what it would like to think back what it has been like, to have these conversations with like my own parents, my own family, and then to also be working in collectives alongside other Peruvians in the diaspora. Like what is brought up in each of these spaces is very different, right? And the ways that we navigate these conversations in these different spaces looks very different, I think. And also a piece of like, you touched on privilege before, but I really think that it is a privilege for us to be able to ask, receive these stories. And then for us to then be able to like educate ourselves, right? Because I think that even in Peru, and we've seen it throughout these elections, and we've seen it in the past, that it's not, I don't know if like accurate information regarding specific issues, candidates is always readily available to the people in Peru, right? That are going to be the most affected. Often I find that like I'm searching elsewhere, I'm not searching for the like some local Peruvian stations on what they have to say, like
I completely agree. I had a conversation with my mom on the phone, and she was telling me what something a newspaper had said, and I was like, that's really interesting, because in the United States you don't listen to a certain newspaper because you know of its political values and ideas. So then how come you can't do the same over there, right? And that's the sort of the thing I've realized, is that things that apply here don't apply over there. And it's really weird. It's really weird to, when we talk about, Afro, Indigenous, the idea of gender and sex equality, these are things that like people will, come to the United States and say how it's impossible that we're not equal, but then want to keep these status quos or these ideas back home. And it's just kind of wild to me. It's like, here you want to be equal, but over there it's like, no, how dare we want to be equal? So it's really funny to me, but it's also made me really be more vocal, and also be more intuitive, right? I think a lot of the times our Peruvian identity is just the culture, the music, the song, never the actual history and the politics, right? And that's something that's so important to have both in our head, because they usually go hand in hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think for me, my biggest issue is that what people usually criticize me for is that I haven't gone back. So like, I'm 27, I came when I was 7, and I went back once, if I'm not incorrect, but it was very briefly, like for a couple of days. And then haven't been back since. So I really am very disconnected in that form of like being physically present there. And well, my cousins have gone back. So it's like, oh, well, Peruvians think like this, or we think like this, so we, and it's like, yeah, sure, perhaps they do, but like, that doesn't negate my ideas or my values, or like what defines the issues, right? Like, you can feel a certain way, but that doesn't change things. So it's also really interesting, I think.
Very interesting. And it's just, as you're speaking, interesting to me that we hear these things of like, Peruvians think this way, Peruvians feel this way, Peruvians do this, and there's no singular Peruvian, right?
No.
Like, so as you said, right, like, how does that negate my experiences then, right? Because I think like at the end of the day, like you're Peruvian, right? Like, and I'm Peruvian, and it doesn't matter how often we have gone back, it doesn't matter, like what area we're from, but if we're thinking about it in terms of like the national like land, right? Like, it's like, okay, well, I'm from there, right? So it's like I'm Peruvian. And so thank you for bringing that up, because I find that sometimes, you know, as I'm speaking to folks who reside outside of Peru, I also hear these notions of like feeling disconnected. Um, and so I'm wondering how the experience of living in the diaspora has affected, you know, how you see your Peruvian identity.
Oh, like completely. And this is actually a question. This is a question that I ask myself almost like daily. And it also like screams at me when like really big life things are happening. Like I just got married recently. And it really screamed at me this question because for me it was like, well, if I stayed in Peru, would I have married this person? Right? Would I be who I am? Would I talk the way I do? Would I have the same political ideas or values? Would I pick the same major? Would I have, like these, and you can go crazy with these kind of questions, right? So they're not good for you either. But to me, they're about also realizing that in my mind, I think about this other person I could have been. Whether she would have been better or worse, I do not know. But it's also really interesting to also look at the privilege of that, right? Like perhaps I would have not had the same experiences or opportunities, right? Even though some were limited here because I wasn't documented. But it has pushed me to sort of have both senses in both things, right? It also sometimes it pushed me to be like a person who's very much more optimistic in certain ways, even though I don't act that way. If you ask my friends, they're like, you're not optimistic, but I am. Because being in the diaspora, being a person who is Peruvian, but not because you're not living in the mainland, but then you're also here with around other Peruvians, it's not the same. Because if you find that a lot of Peruvians here are from Lima or say they're from Lima, right? And it's because even in these gatherings, in these home gatherings, in these home parties, where like random Peruvians would gather, who, at the end of the weekend at my uncle's house, you still had that differences in race and in gender and identity. And it was so weird to be surrounded by other Peruvian people and not fully understand like their perceptions, because there is no one Peruvian perception. There's no one Peruvian idea. So I always felt like an outlier in the diaspora, specifically also like in media too, because there's not that much like media about Peruvian people. Like they try to also like, just like there's no one Peruvian idea, there's no one immigrant like story, right? There's no one immigrant story, there's not one Peruvian story. There's just what's it called, an overlay that they try to put on both, and it's not true, right? People's lives are different, people's choices are different. Like for example, my mom loves ABBA, so I grew up with ABBA songs, and I grew up with The Godfather, and I grew up with these movies, and there's very much disconnect sometimes from these like really Peruvian things that people are supposed to do. But at the same time, like I had panettone and chocolate caliente, and I had turron, and like it's just kind of like this division between the two, right? Where you're like Peruvian, I guess, but then at the same time you feel like you're not. That's basically me. Mm-hmm. I'm in between.
Yeah. And you touched on a few things. One is that this possibility. I feel like there's these questions of like who would I have been if I was not in the diaspora, right? Like if you would have stayed in Peru, like would you have evolved into this person you are now? And that is a question. I think also a question that I ask myself like daily, like maybe like 2-3 times a day, because it's so true, right? And I think that sometimes we can make ourselves so tired just thinking about all of the what ifs, but I also think that they're valid questions, right? Because I think that it's a part of how we start to think, like critically think about what it means to be Peruvian, or what it means to have or try to build a relationship with Peru in whatever way that looks for us, right? Because like you said, there's no singular Peruvian, there's no singular immigrant story. And I think that there's also ways that the diaspora shifts how we practice traditions, how much we eat the food, if we're listening to the music. So like there's little aspects of culture, like you mentioned before, right? That we have to include both like these traditions, these foods, the music, as well as like the political history, and like our family history. But I think that they get really shifted when you are living outside of the mainland. And as you're speaking also, right, I think it touches on like the bigger questions of why I even wanted to do this project, because I think that, I grew up in South Florida. My family's from Iquitos, and I just remember like not feeling like you said, like I also felt like an outlier. And I was just like not seeing us, like you said, in the media. I wasn't seeing, and if I were seeing Peruvians, it was like the white limeños, right? Like I wasn't seeing charapa women. I wasn't seeing, indigenous, like Afro-Indigenous folks. I wasn't seeing queer trans folks. And so that's very real. And also sitting in academia in this position of like such large privilege, I was also told that I was going to have access to like, anything that I needed, I was going to find, right? And then I was like, okay, so then where are we? Like, I was like, I don't see any Peruvians in your in your textbooks, right? Like, I don't see, especially queer Peruvians in your texts. And so I think part of it is like, that's why I'm archiving, part of this project, because I wanted to see Peruvians. I wanted to see queer Peruvians. And I also would have loved to know that there were more of us out there, like, especially like living in the diaspora. And so I want to shift a little bit, if it's all right with you, to talking about queerness. And so my question to you is, what does queerness mean to you?
Such a loaded question. What does queerness mean to me? It's really interesting because queerness has had, I think, a different shifts in my life on what its definition is, right? Queerness when I was a child was bad. It was negative, you're going to hell, that sort of mentality. What's it called? And even in my own family, there was a sort of shift because my sisters were much more liberal at that time. They're much older than me, so they were sort of leaving that sort of like mindset that my parents had instilled upon us. And we're kind of like, no, like, you shouldn't think like that. It's okay to be queer. But I was kind of like, no, like, it's not, because that's what I was taught. And then you like go through school and you meet more people and queerness, and then you become to college. And for me, it was more of the aspect that like queerness is just, I always, and this is like my own assumption, I now come to the feeling that I think everybody's a little queer. Because to me, queerness is just about being your authentic self, but also being your authentic self in a way that is accepted mainly, like it's accepted by you, right? Sometimes it's hard to accept ourselves. So for me, queerness is the fact that I feel comfortable being able to say that I'm queer. And I don't even really know like where it ends or where it begins, right? For me, queerness is just me. And I'm queer, and I have friends that are queer. Some people are queer, some people are not, and that's okay too. It just, to me, it just also means happiness overall. Like, it's a really weird sort of like abstract of the terminology to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that you're describing your journey with thinking through queerness, and I know that it's like a big question, right? Like I think that I don't know if we're often given spaces where we can like just answer questions like this. Like I think that even if someone were to ask me what does queerness mean to me, like I would still have to stop and think about it. Because like you said, right, like I also don't know where it starts or where it begins. Like I think that it's very like, it's almost like it can't be contained, right? Like you can't grasp queerness. It encompasses so many things. And so what about like your queer identity? Can you talk to me a little bit about, your relationship with your queer identity?
So my queer identity is so weird because it's like there were signs as a child that I was queer, but like there's no conversation to have, right? Like I lived in a very, very Christian household, like where like if my friends called like 7, 8 o'clock, my mom would answer and she'd be like, "This is a Christian household," and hang up, and I'd be like, "What's happening?" What's it called? She and obviously like the reason I'm going to mention a lot of my mom is because my parents divorced and my father goes back to Peru and my mom stays here with us. So I'm sure my dad would have been the same. But she was the person who mainly raised me while I was a child in here, in the United States. So what's it called? It was the idea of the fact, and I don't know how lewd I can get here. I don't know if that's okay. I was like, let's talk about like the fact when you discover things like pornography or things that are like are supposed to develop sexual desire out of you. I never was interested in like female and mask things because to me it was just really awkward. And what's it called? I was more into female things, right? And that to me that should have been like a sign there, but I was like, oh, it's fine. They seem like they know what they're doing. Because also like when you look at masked female porn, it just looks like it's more geared to mask. Yeah. So it's kind of like, why do I want to see this? Like this is doing nothing for me. And then when I got older, I remember like my sister had a poster of the Backstreet Boys, and it was a poster where they only have like their boxers on. No, I'm sorry, they don't have boxers on. I think Brian only had boxers on because he's Christian. And what's it called? My sister and my aunt were talking, and they were trying to zoom in to see if they can see anything, you know. And I was just so perplexed. I was like, why are people so interested in seeing penises? Like, I don't get it. To this day, I still don't get it. Like, you know, I'm someone that has a male genitalia, but I'm always like, yeah. So it's really interesting. And then when I got older, I kind of, I thought femmes were cute, but I wasn't really like a sexual desire to me. What's it called? And then, I predominantly liked masks. I predominantly liked, what's it called? White, blue-eyed blonde people, because I was brought up to think that was the ideal of beauty. Actually, I had a conversation with my niece once when she asked me like, why did I choose not to end up with a blonde person or like a white person? And I said to her, I said, the reason why is because I would never know if I love them because I was made to love, like I was basically taught to do it, or because it came from me naturally, like, So I'm really glad that I ended up like a brown person with me, but that's besides the point. What's it called? I think for me, things kind of escalated when I was in college. I think it was like my third year of college. My friends were kind of like, maybe you're queer. And I was like, I don't know, man. I don't think so. And I went to a party. We were at some like restaurant, but like a back room was a club in Wynwood. Like it's really weird.
Is it Koyo?
Like probably. It's really weird. It's like a restaurant. You're eating at it like a place, and then you go back and there's a room, and I was like, okay, I guess. And there was this girl there, and I almost kissed her, and then because my friend was like, what are you doing? You're drunk. And I was like, oh, okay. And then we went back home, and that's when I was kind of started thinking about it. I was like, okay, so like, what is this queerness? What does it mean? Like, am I gay? I don't think I'm gay. I like masculine, I like femme, so am I bi? And so for most of my life, I thought maybe I'm bi. But then recently, for example, my wife came out as trans femme. And a lot of people messaged me or had questions about it for me. Because they were like, oh, what are you going to do now? And I was like, I don't know, stay with them. Like, I'm happy. I knew about this. It wasn't like it was a blindsided thing. It wasn't like, if you have a trust between you and your partner, you would have these conversations. So I did, and that's what she felt like. She wanted to come out publicly and she wants to begin this process and being her authentic self. And I said, that's great. I was like, I have no problem about it because, I'm still attracted to her. So it's not a big deal. And that also caused a lot of issues because people were like, you're not straight. And I was like, no, I've never been straight. I never thought of myself as straight. I just never put that label of queerness, which is a privilege in itself, right? I never had to sort of say, like, I'm queer, I'm gay, like, here's my space. And that might also be because, again, I predominantly dated masked people, or I fooled around with masked people, and I married someone that looked masked, right? That presented themselves as masked at the time. So my life, it was, like, very normal. But it's also when in my marriage that I get to explore these queerness aspects of myself, right? You have someone who you can have these conversations with without the fear of retribution, right? Kind of like, well, this is what I used to watch as a child. What kind of porn do you like? Do you like this stuff? Do you like this stuff? You know, it's really interesting being an adult and walking around with your partner to like a sex shop, for example, and being able to discuss things openly, publicly, and not feel any shame, which is something that my family really did because of like Christian values, and also because, you know, when you're born in that time period, sex is very shamed and very subdued and very, we don't talk about this, you don't have it till you're married. So, you know, so it was that too.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that with me. And it sounds like your partner, you know, within your marriage, it's been a place of it sounds like a lot of affirmation. It sounds like a place of safety and openness. And that's really beautiful to hear that you have, you know, your partner to be able to have these conversations with, because I think that when you are, you know, with someone, you know, and even navigating relationships, and you're able to have these conversations, I think it really makes a difference in how we can, you know, like think of our own identities, you know, because I think also like identities are so relational. And also, you know, you were sharing that your own journey with queerness, it went through different shifts in itself, right? Like as depending on what circumstance had come up, right? Like being at that club in that back room. I feel like it's Coyo tacos is what it sounds like. It's so.
I think so. We did have tacos. Yes, I think so. It's a very weird space. Woodwood's a very weird space to be in.
Yeah, like
especially even more so now. But yeah, like it's really weird. And I was just thinking about the fact that I think even like as a young adult, right, when you have your friends and your friends validate your conversations, right? It's really weird. It's different. Not weird. I'm sorry. It's different when you have a person, your spouse or your partner. Like I had never had a conversation with Dorian. What's it called? To the point where like I was validated in my actions. Like it was kind of, these are my statements and they're just accepted as they are. There's no what if, oh, but maybe, oh, things. Like it was just, okay, you said this, that's fine, you know? And that was really interesting to also have, because I've never had that reassurance from my family. What's it called? And it's just also, that has, I don't think so much to do with queerness, but more of like the way we were raised, right? In a way where like everybody has a bunch of secrets and we just keep it hidden down until we become adults and we're like, okay, like this is it, you know? And that's one thing that I have done, like with my sisters, for example. They've been very supportive, very kind, very sweet about it, accepting, what's it called? And we've had these conversations and they kind of have follow-up questions sometimes because they don't understand certain things, which I get it, right? Like it's, even though they're still technically millennials, they're a much older spectrum of millennials. And so they're kind of like, okay, but does this mean this or does this mean this? Like the idea of gender and sexuality, right? Like when my partner came out as trans, they were like, oh, so does she like men? And I was like, no, gender and sexuality are two different concepts, right? And that's, you know, that's something people don't understand. Same with me. I was like, I'm still me. I was like, whether you find out I'm queer today or tomorrow, I was like, I'm still same old me, you know, still like, you know, this, so it's very interesting to see how sometimes people will think of you differently, right? I think it's slowly become more muted nowadays. But I wanted to talk to you about something. I want to ask you a question, and if I'm allowed to ask you a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Happened recently where like a younger person, like or a relative of my spouse said that she just came out as gay, was queer, non-binary queer. And it was really interesting because she was coming out to different people, like different, but within my age group, right? And we were all like, oh, that's cool. You know, that's great. Thanks for telling us. Like, that's dope. And it was just there, you know? But she was really taken aback because she expected us to be like, oh my God, like, you know, make a big deal out of it. But I think, and I found it really interesting that we've come to a point now where we don't. And it's because it's kind of more accepted, which is really interesting because we're trying to be like more acceptive, be like, oh, that's cool. You know, like, that's who you are. But I guess she really wanted us to be like really emotional, which I felt bad about. I was like, oh no. Because I was just like, oh, it's just like, just a Tuesday. You're queer. It's okay.
Yeah.
Let's get ice cream anyway,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that I notice more. I have two younger siblings, and I remember talking to them about queerness, and I don't know, because I think that it's almost like I see younger queer folks kind of just having it be like it's like, okay, it's like a fact, like whatever, like queer, like I'm trans, I'm non-binary, like it's like, and I think that older like maybe even like around my age or some older folks had more of a like sit down coming out. It was a little bit more emotional depending on who they shared with. But I've even seen a shift in like people just like, or like younger folks especially, just being like, whatever, they don't even feel like they need to come out, they kind of just like go on about and do their thing. So I don't know, like I've definitely seen the shift. I never really had a coming out. I kind of just was and like left it at that. I know that I like, I'm very loud about it. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that it sounds like the person that came out, maybe just wanted to be seen a little bit more.
I think so too. And we felt really bad, but it was kind of like, it was a really interesting shift. And I was like, oh wait. I was like, you want us to be really loud about it? I was like, but it's interesting. I mean, obviously, I think now there's much more of an issue with trans people coming out. Like that's still very much relevant, right? I think there's been much more of an acceptance in certain communities about certain queerness, but not others, right? Mm-hmm. And then like to the point that when my partner was like, I think I'm gonna come out, I was like, we were in the process of getting this house, and I was like, oh, maybe we should sell it and move to a more queer friendly neighborhood like Wilton Manors. But then I found out that Wilton Manors actually is very white, like cis gay men. Mm-hmm. And what's it called? I think a lot of people also don't talk about the fact that even in queerness, you can be queer and be racist, be sexist. And that's a big issue. What's it called? Because people think that when we fit into this queerness umbrella, we're all the same, we're all equal, and it's like, it's not the same. Like, how many queer people are also really racist and really like anti, like, or like Islamophobic in many ways, and things like that. And so it's really interesting to sort of see this dynamic. And like, even when we compress into smaller groups or like subsets, there's still even more separations because there's not that unity. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And also, I think it goes back to your point earlier, right? With this notion of like gender and sexuality aren't the same thing. And so I think even in queer spaces, right? Like and you said, like Wilton Manors, like I'm familiar with Wilton Manors, and it is very white, cis, gay, like, and there's been occurrences of like transphobia there.
Oh, yes.
From, these white gay men. And it's just like we can say maybe there's an umbrella of queer, and it doesn't mean that there are not issues of racism, sexism, transphobia, right, within queer groups. And on that note, I'm curious as to how you see queer community. So what does queer community mean to you?
That's also interesting because like I said, I'm 27 and I've never been fully like fleshed out in my identity, right? Like, and even what my identity is, right? Like I will identify as bisexual. But according to some people who message me on Instagram, they will like to say that I'm actually pansexual. And I was like, well, why can't I be both, right? Just because let me live my life. I also find that really interesting how like it's become sort of like, this is your definitions who you have to be by other queer folks. But majority of my friends are queer, right? They're either two-spirit folks or they're what's it called? LGBTQ folks. I'm sorry, I'm the same thing. I'm the same pi folks. They're like, they're just people. And they're my community, they've been my community forever and always. But I feel like now, as specifically me and my spouse now, we want to be more vocal about it. So we're thinking of getting a flag outside of our house. We want to get those little cute hats that said, I can't even think straight. Mm-hmm. That shit. Little pins and stuff, and just kind of be more vocal about it, more portrayal about it. And then we also, like currently I'm applying to law school, what's it called? And so when we move to whatever school accepts me in this process, we also are thinking of moving to a much more liberal city. So it'll be a much easier process for them to transition, right? And so it's to me, it's like, I'm very lucky that I still get to keep that community of folks that I started off with, that are very queer and very accepting, but also at the same time, I got to keep other folks who didn't know I was queer and are accepting of me. But at the same time, like when I came out, I felt like people then expected me to start liking certain things that I didn't, you know? I will say though, the fact that I am interested in I've piqued interest in RuPaul Drag Race, but I haven't watched it yet. But there's a lot of like, I guess what you can call gay chatter or queer chatter about like certain things and conversations, and you feel like you're out of the loop. So now I feel like I have to do work to be in the loop, and I'm sort of like, I guess I was like, I guess I have to do this too. It's like homework. But other than that, it feels pretty great. My community is my friends and my family and my spouse and my partner, and my puppies. They're super cute. What's it called? And that's kind of what it is. It's also opened a lot more conversation with other folks, perhaps, who I kind of had a disconnection, and kind of they came out as queer, and so it was like, oh hey, how are you? Like, let's talk about it. And it's also allowed me to be a little bit more free, and I didn't even realize that. Right? It's not even like a physical free because my wife is trans, like my friends already know, so it's not that. It's more of like an inner freeness, right? Like a sort of like little like something else that was like kind of weighing on you kind of disappears, which you don't even know about, which is really interesting for me. Because like as I say explicitly all the time, I was like, I have very much a big privilege. I never had to come out, so.
Yeah. And also, I think you were touching on notions of like definitions even in queer communities, right? So you identifying as bisexual, and then people being like, well, actually, I think you're pansexual. And I think that's such a problem, right? It's like, because it's like, you're not me, like, and like you said, right, like, why can't I be both? Or why can't I encompass, these labels, these identities, and have it mean something for me, right? I don't think that there's even like the labels I think that we associate with queerness, bisexual, lesbian, pansexual. It's like, it can mean different things for people. And also, I am a like big believer, and I have like said it before, that like queerness isn't even like linear, it's like, I think people assume that you have to like follow this very linear thing. And then once you're finally identifying as such, you can't go back. You can't like identify differently later. Like, and that's not true, right? Because I think that identity is also something that shifts. And I also heard you say that, you feel like you're having to do this like homework of like, these how would I even describe them? Like these queer, I don't know, queer cultural things, like RuPaul's Drag Race almost, right? Like,
do you know what it feels like sometimes? Actually, it's quite funny. It's kind of like what I feel like we've done our whole lives, just me having to do like American homework to understand, and like Peruvian homework, where it's like, okay, I'm going to my cousin's house, I need to know these things. Or I'm going to, like, for example, like things like these, like, like these bands, these white boys, like, what's it called? Bob Dylan and shit like that. I grew up listening to that. My parents were born in Peru. Perhaps there are Peruvians whose parents listen to that, but my parents didn't. My mom listened to ABBA. I was like, so that was the music I listened to, And so it's also really weird when like your friends who are like white or have like parents who were born here what's it called, are have these like relationships that you don't, and so you have to work extra hard to like sort of be like, okay, what does this mean? Or like improving culture, same thing, right? Like my parents also kind of stepped back from that. I didn't really grow up with my mom and my dad, so like they had their own things to deal with. And then now that you're queer, it's like, okay, I'm queer. How do I fit into this group? Like, it's really funny to me because it's just like, again, an outlier like always.
Mm-hmm. And I also think that people aren't comfortable with outliers, right?
Mm.
Like they expect you to know. And I'm just like, okay, then teach me.
Right, but right, because then comes the conversation of then you're not queer enough, then you're not Peruvian enough, then you're not American enough. And it's just like, I'm just me, bro. Like, that's just it. That's why I just mainly hang out by myself. COVID has been really great for me in that regard. I enjoy being home alone. With my spouse and my puppies, so it's like you're not really alone. But yeah.
That's valid. That's real. I think that like the extra labor that's demanded from folks that sometimes straddle like these two worlds, right, or multiple worlds, is just like it's like you said, it's funny in a way to like have to think about, like all the work that you have to do to like prepare to enter a space. But it's the labor, right? Like it's the labor that they're demanding of you. And what does it mean for you to simultaneously identify as Peruvian and queer?
It's really interesting. I feel like I see that all the time, right? It's such a like a college like interview thing. It's interesting. But what I mean by that is just that I feel like my Peruvian identity is so tied to my family, and specifically like the older people in my family, right? And I feel like I'll have to create a new bridge by myself rather than have it be supported by the older folks in my family. Like my parents don't know I'm queer. They don't know my spouse is out. And it's not more of like an act. I slowly started telling them more things about myself, right? And between my sisters, they were like, probably dad might be okay with it, mom, why not? Or it really depends. And then comes like the aspect of like my cousins, which I feel like some of them know, and they're just like, that's just Wendy. Like I feel like every year I come out with a new thing, and they're just like, oh, that's her. But like the older folks, like my uncles, my aunts, people who still live in that sort of like mentality or state of being that is very against all these things. Like not even talking about queerness and Peruvian separate, like talking about my Peruvian identity, right? Like the fact that I call myself that I call myself Quechua, or that I identify more with our indigenous background, has been a really big issue, really big backlash, caused problems because people don't want to talk about it or acknowledge it. It's very easy to say that you're from a city and not really talk about what it means to be from that city. And then let's add to that DNA test, right? When we took DNA tests, and I know I'm going on a tangent or like a different point, but we're all taught in Peru, right, that we're all half native and half white, right? And that's why we can't say shit about either group because we're both. And so let's move on, right? But then, which is really crazy, right? Because 50% blood of being Native American is a huge thing. But no. And so when DNA tests came out, it was like a really big thing. We all took one, and my sisters were like, watch us only be 50%. And I was like, I'm pretty sure we're full-blooded. I was like, if we look at facts, and it did, we were. And that was like a whole thing too then, But I'm glad that I've pushed for these things, right? There's spaces to push. And now my sister, for example, when COVID statistics came out, she didn't look at Hispanic statistics. She looked at statistics based on Native people. And she was like, this is why we have more problems with COVID. So it was really interesting to see sort of this shift in perspective. But that's like the issue. In Peruvian identity, in Peruvian relation to my family, I have already dividends, right? An issue where I'm causing problems. And then comes queerness. And I feel like within my family, my immediate family, like my sisters, very supportive, very helpful. I have a brother. He's also like in the church. I don't know how he feels about it. I don't know if he knows. And then comes my mother and my father. And I don't know how that's going to come about, the relationships that could break from that. And then my other relatives, right? Because I have a relative who is gay. in Peru. And what's it called? Like, he is accepted by the family, like they like him, right? But no one talks about the fact that he's gay, right? It's kind of like he is, and we just never mention it. It's like you said it once, and it just like the earth ate it, and that's it. We know you're gay, but we just won't say it. And then the fact that like my mom will still pray for him to become straight. So it's already these things where you're just like, okay, and it's really interesting to sort of see the way families perhaps aren't against it, but just won't accept it either. They kind of just keep it in limbo in this sort of weird in-between space, kind of like how we're indigeneity. They'll keep it in this weird limbo space of we are, but we aren't, and let's just keep it hush. So that's kind of how everything ties together for me. That's why I'm always an outlier. I'm always like, I don't know, man. I feel like eventually it will come out to everybody. Most likely, probably soon, just because it's like, I feel like I'm very vocal about it on Instagram and on my social media pages. So it's all just depends on the day they decide to click on my page and see it. But I'm not afraid of repercussions. And I think it's only because I'm so much older. I'm 27, I pay for my own things. I have my own house. I'm grown, I'm married. And it's kind of like, it doesn't care what people think of me because of it. I also want to add the fact that I keep mentioning a lot my marriage, and it's because we're really taught, I think, as a culture in Peru, that women don't really have value until they're married. So that's one of the things I always use when I talk to my parents whenever they say something to me. I'm like, well, I'm married, so like you can't say shit to me. And patriarchy for your own ways. In that regard.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that with me. I really appreciate you talking about the ways that you see your indigeneity, your Peruvianness, your queerness all, interact with one another, because I think that you said that, sometimes, families keep these things in limbo, right? Whether it's indigeneity or queerness. And I think sometimes, I want to say that sometimes, that happens because it's almost, it might feel more comfortable. It might feel, like safer to do that versus having to really ask ourselves the hard questions of, where is my family actually from? How do I really think about gender and sexuality, and I think that also, at least from what I have seen, in Peru, or like even within my own family in Peru, is that, those aren't conversations that we're just having casually, right? Even with indigeneity, even with my own indigeneity, I have had to do a lot of the work of unpacking what that looks like, unpacking, what my great grandmothers went through, asking so many questions, not getting many answers. And I think the same with queerness, right? Like my family has acknowledged that I am queer in Peru, but I don't know, right? That's just not something that we talk about, right? Unless I bring a partner around, and it's just, I imagine, like, even, I imagine even for you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that it's just always, you're always having to think about how to navigate these conversations, or how you interact with different members of the family, right? So it's like how one member reacts is not how another member is going to react. Do you feel that your identities coexist in the same spaces?
Yes, I think now they do. And most importantly now, because one thing that I have done, I'm very proud of and also very privileged for, is the fact that I was able to take ownership of them all, right? I always felt like I was more fragmented because I never really understood where I stood in this sort of like division between I'm not American enough, I'm not Peruvian enough, what am I? And then coming to a sense of understanding what it was to be Quechua and be native, and taking that right back and kind of saying, no, like this doesn't make sense. And also in that way, bringing up a lot of the childhood things my uncles and aunts went through, right? And and having this sort of conversation. And it, for me, like in a lot of ways, I guess you can say it might seem like I'm more in pieces, right? Because I've sort of like separated myself more and more and more from groups. But for me, it actually feels much more clearer because I can be like, I'm Wendy, I'm queer, I'm Native, and I'm from Peru. And it's not, they're not separate from each other. They're not, one's not negate the other. They're all the same thing. I get to be all of them. And if you don't like it, get to look out. That's basically that. At this point in my life, I'm just like, that's who I am. And also like I want to add undocumented. It's really weird because I'm documented now, but I realize that so much of what I do or how I live my life is still very tied to undocumented identity to this day. I think I still have lived my life more undocumented than I've been documented. So maybe when I've lived more as a documented person, that'll change, but I don't know. To me, it's still so fresh in my memory.
Yeah.
Like we talked about earlier, about me moving a lot because I was undocumented and how it still affects me in my marriage and the way I do things, which I didn't realize. So like I was much older and I talked to my sister about it. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's real in the sense that like I hear you mention that it still feels fresh in your mind, right? At least this notion of being undocumented. And you also named, like you would think that you would feel more fragmented, but really you feel, like what I heard is like, you also feel more assured, it sounds. And even in how you're speaking, like I can also see you being like really grounded within your identities. And that's really beautiful to hear and to witness, because I think that often when we carry so many different identities and we are impacted by so many different, structures, systems, but then within our own spaces, what we face, I think people may assume that like we're just like we don't feel powerful, right? Like we don't feel empowered in who we are, and it sounds like you're really firm in your identities, right? Even as they've shifted.
No, for sure, and I think this also took a lot of time, right? Like being able to call myself Native in Quechua took a very long time, took years, because I felt very uncomfortable. Not only because of like the history aspect, because it's also like I can say 100% sure, and like people brought this up, and I'm like for sure, it's the aspect that even though I identify as Quechua, I have never lived like a Quechua person, right? To say that I go back to Peru to have the same traumas, to have the same like disadvantages, not at all. So I completely get that point. I was like, but that doesn't deny it. And like I tell people, I was like, when I claim my Native identity, it's not like, oh, my great, or like I'm 112. I was like, I'm full blooded. I was like, my grandparents came from this town. They came to Lima, had my parents. I was like, and that's why I was like, I was getting into these fun conversations with my cousins. Because I'm always like, so you're telling me that like, I was like, your grandparent came here, Lima, to the city, had your parent married somebody else from similar community, and then they had you, but you're not Native. How does that work? I was like, how does that make sense? Mathematically, like how do we get here? I was like, but it's really interesting to see how immigration trauma displaces you from your identity. And I am so like, I know there's a lot of people who are undocumented and are having these conversations. And to me, it's just so mind blowing because I never could have at those moments. And I'm so proud of them. I'm so like in awe of them. A lot of organizers and community members who literally do that. And I'm just like, how? Because when I was going through that process, it's just like survival. Never really like let me sit down with my mom and have these conversations or questions or question other people about it. So it's really interesting, and it's just so much more freeing now to be able to claim these things and not be afraid of retribution because someone out there doesn't think I'm Native, or because someone out there won't classify me as certain things or queerness or my Peruvianness. It's just like I don't really care because my identity doesn't come from the approval of other people. It comes from me and who I am, and that's just who I've always been. Even if I didn't know it, even if I didn't, like even 6 years ago, I didn't define myself as Native. I was still Native. What's it called? These identities have always been part of me. just now I have the privilege of being able to say them.
Mm-hmm. And that the process that it is, right? Also to get to the point, you know, that where you are now, right? It's like, I imagine it was such a process for you. You're describing this process to me, and I'm grateful for you sharing all of this, because I think that this part of displacement is so real. And I think that unless, you know, going back to privilege, unless you have gotten to like sit with yourself outside of a survival mode, right? Because I think sometimes in survival mode, you don't get to pause, or you don't get to think about, you know, all of these things that make up who you are. You're kind of just going, right? You're literally trying to survive. And then finally, when you do, the process that it is to be able to like ask yourself these questions, to talk to other people. And there are like amazing orgs, amazing people in the community that are doing this work of like having these conversations, of like educating other folks. Like I've learned so much from like other Indigenous folks that I have seen online and on social media, because it's true, right? So like even for me, like being Indigenous from La Selva, like from, you know, my mom and my abuelitas being like these Indigenous like Amazonian women, right? Like the ways that like I have lived is not how my great grandmother has lived, right? Or even within that, how we see tribal relations in Peru is different. How we understand indigeneity in the United States is very different. So many ways, right? That displacement plays a role in whether or not Native people have access to their own identity, right? Like it's so real. And all of the ways that interacts with like Peruvianness, queerness.
Of course, like I think the reason why I'm so like staunch about my identities is because my whole life they've been negated to me, right? It's specifically my native identity, both by people from Peru and people who are not from Peru, like northern natives. That was also a really big deal in my aspect of my life. And when I became president of the Global Indigenous Group at FIU, I really pushed. I was like, if we're going to talk about global indigeneity, then our indigeneity doesn't stop in the United States. I was like, so I remember I partnered with like Palestinian groups. I partnered with a group that was from Caribbean. And I was like, let's talk about Native people from there. I was like, we need to talk about nativity and our identity in a global scale. I was like, it's so interesting that in one generation, right? Like my mom grew up with her mom from her town, and she grew up with the customs, the culture, the identity. But by the time she turns 12, she converts to Christianism, my mom. What's it called? So then she stops. She doesn't partake in culture, she doesn't partake in language, she doesn't partake in any of these things. She also doesn't go back to our village. She just didn't like it, so she never went back. And because of that, when we are born, she never takes us. So it's really interesting to see that like in one person, the disconnect completely happens, and then we come here obviously, and then that's a bigger disconnect. But that doesn't negate your culture, right? Just as the same as northern natives were taken out of reservations and brought into city to become city Indians to sort of what's it called, displace their communities. The same thing happened to us in the form of immigration. We came here and we were displaced, and then some of us are finding our way back. I also want to add, because it's become a really big issue, right? It's like not all people from Latin America are indigenous. That's also very true. I was like, that's, you know, let's not confound things. But there are some of us who are, and we are very valid in our identity, and we should have, you know, the ability to speak about it and talk about it. And I know it's very also scary for my family. They were very like, I'm the one who's done a lot of things, like, you know, like politics. I've done protesting. I've gotten arrested. I've done all these things for activism, you know, even while I was, what's it called? Even when I became documented, my arrest was because I was protesting against the removal of TPS and DACA, because I was a DACA recipient when I was younger. And I was like, for me, the idea always came about the fact that, you know, like if some of us were given the privileges or the benefits to rid ourselves of documentation, why then do we not ourselves want others to not be rid of that, right? And that also upset me a lot because you see it in a lot of communities. When you become documented, that's it. You like, okay, move on. I live my life now. And that's not the way it should be, which is also connected to the fact that like we leave our country, we come here, now we're new people and we don't think about our country anymore. And it's all like, you can't do that. Like you can't, so I know some people do it to, you know, not think of the trauma and to move on and like go. But at the same time, I think if we don't really think about those things, we don't really think about what happened in the first place, right? Like, for example, I have a lot of memory loss from my childhood because my mom claims it's because of immigration, right? Like I can't remember things, like things that I think like high school, middle school, like things for me go so quickly because I don't recall them because of like how we moved a lot. We went from place to place. My mom and I had to do a lot of things. My mom and I cleaned houses together. My sisters cleaned houses. Like it's a different life. And then you're like the fact that now I'm 27 and I own my own home. It's really wild to me. Like I never thought in my life I would ever own a home. So it's pretty crazy to think of that process. And so sometimes because at the same time you achieve your quote unquote American dream or your happiness, you think, okay, let's not go back then. We're here now, let's focus on the happiness. Then I think it does a disprivilege to our own traumas, the traumas of our relatives, and also the people who don't have the privilege to be able to fight against them. So I'm very vocal in that part. I get really angry, specifically now with these elections and a lot of Peruvians and their ideas. And for me, most specifically, it's the idea, and I know I've alluded to it and I haven't explicitly said it, but it's the fact that I have relatives who were undocumented here, right? And they, you know, were voted blue, were leftist, these ideas, and we'll go back to our country and say, well, we can't have leftist ideas at home, right? And not just like regarding this election, but at all, like the idea of equality, right? You know what inequality is because you've lived it here. People from Lima, you know, Limeños who are very rich and come here and are upset because they don't have the same rights because they're not documented. So then they become documented and they know what it's like and will go back to their home country where they are wealthy and continue to spew these ideas of classism. So it's really crazy to me how we don't really even realize how we compartmentalize or like divide our identities, where we can be Peruvians in the United States and Peruvians in Peru, and they're always going to be separate. We just keep separating it, regardless of whether we come here for immigration or for money or for whatever we come here for, or whatever time period of our lives we come here for. Things are always different in Peru than here. And I just don't get why.
Yeah, you touched on so much, and I want to thank you for everything that you've shared because, you know, you touched on your indigeneity, your own work in terms of like, you know, being undocumented, and then with DACA, and also you touched on the generational differences, right? And what it means to then acknowledge that there's generational trauma that makes folks maybe want to acknowledge pieces of our history differently. And as you named, right, things are going to be different in the United States or, you know, outside of Peru than they are in Peru. And I think, you know, as the elections have shown, Peru right now is really divided, like very divided, almost like down the middle, you know, with these election results. And it is really wild to see how people in Peru continue maybe to not acknowledge the realities of the history that Peruvians have faced in the country, right? Regarding Sendero Luminoso, regarding this fear of the left. And also, right, we can tie that back to generational trauma that makes it so like now as like informed, like us being like informed adults, right, we can have these like conversations with like other people. And that's a privilege to do that as well, right? To like think critically through these elections. And Yeah, I share with you in this, like, looking at what's going on in Peru, looking at what's going on here, and seeing the differences, right? And where people's privileges are, because they shift, right? So like your oppression in one place can be a privilege somewhere else, right?
Oh,
So
of course.
yeah, and you named it.
That's a sick joke. It's the fact that you can be privileged in Peru, be oppressed here, so you want privileges, get them, and then go back to Peru and then oppress. And it's just like, where? How did we get this? You know, it really does show you the inequalities. And what I think is also really interesting is the fact that people negate themselves a lot. They just say, "Oh, well, we can't have these things in Peru. We just can't have these ideas and concepts." And that's one of the things where I really also get to use my privilege of my degrees, right? Like I have a bachelor's in English literature and I have a master's in finance. And I get to have these conversations with my dad and my uncles and kind of be like, well, let's discuss these things. I was like, I was like, perhaps in a space where they're not used to a woman being part of, right? Because they're not used to like, and I'm like, no, like let's sit down, like you're drinking your beers, I don't care, like let's have this conversation. I was like, we're all adults here now. I was like, and what is like, even though you have no degrees to back up your consent, I have a master's degree, right? And at least that allows me to be heard by these men. And it's really interesting to sort of sit down and be like, let's talk economics, let's talk these things. And it's like, we're able to have these conversations about how equality, what and equality in gender and sexuality are so important to Peru, and the fact that whatever candidate we get, I don't think we're going to get that, and that's a big issue. We don't have the right, the equality for women, the equality for sex, the equality for gender, or for identity, and it's such a big issue in Peru in regards to the aspect of the deaths of a lot of LGBTQ folks, specifically trans folks. And it's so important that we change that in our country because it limits us, right? When we limit ourselves by gender, by race, by identity, then we limit what our country can do and what our community can achieve. Because then we're not allowing these folks to be able to be live to their fulfillment, to their fulfilling lives, which can create much more for our country and can better it. And it's just ridiculous that at this point in 2021 we still have these antiquated ideas and these beliefs that do nothing but hinder us, whether in regards to like more liberal social aspects and also economic aspects. Like to me, I was just like my whole point is just like how your country can't do anything if like over 70% of its population lives under the poverty line. Like you just can't do anything, and I just don't know how people don't get that. It doesn't matter that you're rich. You can't become richer if the other people are poor because they then have no money to give you in this capitalism structure. So how are you going to get your money? It's just like even in the most basic of ideas, it's like, what are you doing? And then I get angry, and then I write essays to my cousins on Facebook. And then my sisters just laugh because they're like, what are you doing? And I was just like, they're like, it's a Sunday, enjoy your Sunday. And I'm just like, but this is so frustrating because in the most basic of ideas of it all, if we can't even find common ground, then what are we going to do? Mm-hmm. So, and I find the frustration here, right? But I can only imagine the fear over there, whichever side you wanted to vote for, right? It's scary because half the country wants one side, half the other country wants one side. One side thinks they're all going to be killed from the other side thinks they're all going to be killed from the other side. So it's kind of like, what do you do? And that's the realistic. I don't know. So I can only imagine what it's actually like to be down there. My family's down there. Like my father and my mom are currently in Peru, as are like majority of my dad's side and some of my mom's side. So it's really interesting because even amongst themselves, they're divided, right? And so like my father knows my opinions. And so he like has strayed from talking to me about it because he knows I was like, at the end of the day, I was like, I'm right. I was like, and I can tell you why. And I was like, these are my sources. What are your sources? Like, el comercio, like shit. So I go like, but it's just life.
Absolutely, though, right? And you named, even in thinking about the candidates that we had to choose, it's whether it was the right or the left, none of them had any form of policy legislation that would protect queer and trans Peruvians, right? If anything, they were like outwardly transphobic and homophobic.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Like that's at least, I guess, something the majority of the population can agree on, which is really sick.
Which is exactly right. And it's just like and you even named it, right? It's like there is a very real frustration in watching Peru go through this, right? And you named, like, I also can't imagine the fear, right, that is currently happening. The tension, every single time I speak to family in Peru, it's like, oh, we're tense, right? We're anxious, we're this. And it's like, personally, I've had the privilege to step away, right? Like I've stepped away from my phone. Like I've just like, you know what? I know the election results are going to take some time. I don't have the emotional capacity to engage in this 24/7, but it's like in Peru, that's all that it is right now, right? And
of course,
people are anxious, people are tense, and even, speaking to some queer and trans folks that I know, they're right. It's like, it's almost like in your face again, right? Like this violence that we hear that happens in Peru, right? Towards the, LGBT community. That's like, they face disproportionate amounts of violence in Peru. We can say that happens here as well in the US, with people paying with their lives for like harm and violence done against, queer and trans bodies. And like what I'm hearing a lot is that it's like really in your face at this moment, right, with these elections.
Oh, for sure. And they can't, like, it's really annoying because at least I've been able to get to that point with my family where it's kind of like, why should you suffer for just existing, right? If we're all here, like, and I always bring it back to the United States. I was like, you all talk about how great the United States is. Like here, you should be able to do what you want and live your life, right? Fine, right? We all accept that. Why can we also accept that in Peru? Like, and be able to have those conversations and compare it here, right? I'm like, how come it's okay for you to want those things here, but then not over there? Like, how does that make sense? And so in a lot of ways you can use, I sort of see that shift, right? And kind of like, okay, not acceptance, but more of like, you're right, like, why should I care? Let me just be nonchalant about it and just move on. I'm like, yeah, you should, like, it doesn't harm you. Nothing, this doesn't harm you. So why should you care about someone's queerness to the point that you are willing to take their life? It doesn't make sense. And I find it must be terrifying because, and it's taken such a long time. And I think it's something really interesting to point out is the fact that, like, in the United States, right, when candidates become, like, they're like the two main ones, right? We go to their website or their page or whatever, and then they tell you, like, this is all my views, these are all my policies. It took me forever to be able to find one for either of the candidates, right? It wasn't, I think, till like after the voting happened that like those documents were like publicly released and you can kind of sort of see what they were going to do and what their policies were economically, social, whatever. But what's also really interesting is that neither of them had like an LGBTQ, what's it called, like statement or agenda or anything. And so it was like, what's, like, I know COVID's a big deal, but also like, or, you're going to be president for 5 years. Right. Let's look at what's happening, but it's really interesting. And I also, to add to the fact that, like, even in these conversations, like when we speak about Peru, we have now moved into like the Andean and coast side, but we still don't talk about the rainforest, and we still don't talk about Black people. It's kind of like completely omitted. Where right now the country looks like Lima versus like everywhere else, but everywhere else is mainly the Andes, and it's like, no, there's still so much more Peru and so much more identities, and it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also this is going to be a big question, but like we know, right, that queer and trans Peruvians face like disproportionate amounts of harm, violence, coupled with identities such as, being Afro-Peruvian, Afro-Indigenous, right? Like indigenous, campesinos, right? Like coupled with identities, they face disproportionate amounts of harm, violence, there's very real violence on the streets that I hear often, right? And so my question to you is, how do we as queer Peruvians, how do we survive this harm, right? These notions of violence. How do we survive these perceptions that we face, right? Because these candidates, like even in looking at our candidates, none of them even considered an LGBT like policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even made a statement about it, right? Like, and so that's my question to you, right? Like, how do we move? Like, how do we move forward?
I think it kind of, that's where community comes into play, right? And like that's why you understand why queer people usually hang out with other queer folks and why they usually like it's like a posse, because it is scary. Like I had friends who like had very transphobic interactions in Wilton Manors, like you spoke of, or queer phobia happening in very like liberal places in South Florida. Just like with and it does happen. And then I think it really amounts to that, your race, right? The color of your skin and your acceptance. What's it called? I know that when I was in Standing Rock, it was really racist, really anti-Native, but also like, what's it called? I didn't identify queer as then. So, well, I identify as Two-Spirit. I don't identify as that. So, there was a Two-Spirit group in the camp, and they weren't allowed to go into the actual like marches or protests, because that can get really violent. And already they were very anti-Native, anti-brown, and add to that your identity. And I think people don't understand that part, like that it all like adds up. Like people are like, what more can I hate you for? I have very much the privilege of being able to move my locations, and a lot of people can't do that. So when my wife came out, I was like, okay, well then let's, like I told you, like let's figure out where we want to move. Do we want to move to Wilton Manors? Okay, maybe not Wilton Manors. Let me talk to other trans folks that I know. Where can we move? I was like, what city do you feel like is more liberal? What city will let you maybe use your correct pronouns? Let you change your name? Like, well, let's go and do that. And it was so privileged for me to be able to have that conversation, to be able to do that, for her and us to be able to move up and lift up our lives. I know a lot of people can't do that. A lot of people who are kind of displaced because of it, who get kicked out of their homes. And I think maybe that's why subconsciously I never said anything to my parents as a child, because I know of a lot of people who get kicked out of their homes for being, queer. One of my friends got sent away to a like those conversion therapy camps. What's it called? And it's still very much more relevant now, right? Like I think people don't realize how quickly these things are still happening and just happened, right? And also the notions of queerness, right? Like for a fact that sometimes I think about the idea of having kids. I'm not sure if I want kids, I have puppies. And how I wonder if it would still be difficult if one of them were to come out as queer, and if it would be easier for them not to be queer. And it's so interesting to still have these ideas and these thoughts process, right? But I live much more in fear for my spouse. So like we're gun owners. We advocate for the aspect of being able to own guns. And I know there's a lot of groups, which I didn't know about this, but I found it recently. There's a lot of like trans groups and like LGBTQ folks where like they take like queer people and they teach them how to use guns and be able to register under their name so that they have self-defense. So like even in this like conversation about like gun control, we also need to talk about how the fact that like guns are a tool to protect yourself when you are LGBTQ, because people will just are going to kill you for the sake of killing you. And if a gun stops that, so be it. But you don't have those rights in Peru. So like it's very different here than in Peru, right? Here you can still use certain things to your advantage. In Peru, that doesn't exist because anybody can bribe anyone, and money can change here and there. So your rights don't really value or matter. And poverty is so huge there. And I think it's also something we haven't really discussed, and it's because I don't really know so much about it, but I wanted to bring it up. I don't know to ask you if you knew about it. But so during COVID, there's been a lot of displacement, right? Like a lot of people have left Lima and had to like literally trek miles and miles and miles back to their villages. And so I wonder, is the acceptance of trans folk much more accepting in their villages than in the cities? Because that's also a different like mindset and identities. Although I will say this, like my grandparents' village in Tauca, it's very Catholicized. Like all the ceremonies have been converted to like saints. So instead of it being deities, now it's saints. And so like that's how you keep your like the traditions and the festivals and all the things we do. So it's kind of like I wonder how it is also as well, because what happens if you're trans or you're LGBTQ, you're displaced, you have to go back to your village. Perhaps in Lima it's a little easier, perhaps it's not. Like it's a very I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know either, right? So I have heard that I did see a lot of like articles about how people were having to migrate back to their villages, and they would often do so like on foot, right? Like it was COVID. Where are people going to catch their buses? The buses are also unreliable. They're often not safe on the carreteras, you know, like but so I don't know, because I even think in like, you know, colonization really did that in terms of like even in the villages, right? Like even in the villages that my abuelitas are from, heavily Catholicized. Like and it was because, you know, like at least in La Selva and the Amazon during the rubber boom, when the colonizers came in, that's when they took over, right? So yeah, I really don't know, but I'm also curious because there are so many factors, right, that go into levels of safety, levels of access in Peru and in the States. I also think that in a way, right, like that, you know, you mentioned that things like conversion camps are still a very real thing, right? And I think that sometimes, at least nowadays, I think sometimes we forget, right? Because it's like I almost feel like we see a lot of queerness, a lot of transness. I think a little bit more visible, at least on social media. I find that more people that I talk to are open about speaking about these things. But it doesn't mean that there aren't very real like threats towards queer folks, towards trans folks. And so I also, you know, I really also believe that visibility doesn't always equal access, doesn't always equal safety. So thank you for sharing all of that. You also, I know that you've touched on a few of your identities, but I'm wondering if there are any other identities that are particularly salient to you that you would like to share.
I don't think so. I think you know to describe me in three things, it'd be like Wendy, queer, native, Peruvian. What's it called? I think what's similar. I think if I were to add anything in talking about like the safety, is sort of the one thing that I think is relatively the same is the aspect of race. What I mean by that is that in certain cities will be like harbor cities for LGBTQ folks. They might not be accepting of brown and black folks that are LGBTQ. And that's also, I mean, that's Fulton Manors, I think, is a really big aspect of that. And it's the fact that like certain states like California or New York might be really accepting of you if you're queer, but then, you know, you start adding your little other words to that and they're like, maybe not you. And so it's hard. To do that and go through that process. But to answer your question, I think those three are the main big factors: Wendy, Quechua, Native, Indigenous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I know that we've been talking for a little bit, but you know, I do healing work that centers queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people of color. I've been trained in Black feminist methods. I've been trained in the tenets of healing justice. So that's where a lot of my background work is. And so I get really curious, you know, as to how folks center wellness, how they view healing, how they are healing. And so if it's all right with you, like I have a few questions relating a little bit more about those aspects. Okay. So what does wellness look like for you?
Wellness, oof. I know I'm not living wellness right now. I can say that for a fact. I was like, I think wellness is supposed to be like stability. It's supposed to be like open mindset. It's supposed to be like you're okay. You know, I don't think you're ecstatic, but you're okay. I think I'm on the path to wellness. I think we all are in many ways. But I personally what's it called, in my aspect of wellness. What wellness would mean to me would mean maybe like to not be so stressed. But I crave stress because stress gives me purpose. And I feel like as a person who comes from people who had to fight for a place at the table, if I don't have purpose, then what the fuck do I have? And that's such a privilege I see in like other folks who get to just like relax. I can't relax. Like even when I relax, I feel bad about relaxing. And it's so weird because it's like I should be able to enjoy not doing anything, but I can't. So it's really interesting where we feel like we always have to strive for more and strive to better, and not only just for ourselves, but for the fact that we feel like we need to, like like whenever we go anywhere, we're not just Wendy. I don't go someplace and I'm not just Wendy. I am a representative of my identities, which is so annoying. And sometimes it's cool, but sometimes it's just like I just want to be Wendy. Like why do I have to have all these little things that describe me that I also represent? Like maybe today's not my best day, so I'm not going to be the greatest representation of that. But yeah, that's kind of but wellness is just hard, I think, to keep track of and hold and achieve.
It can be, right, especially when like you said, you've been used to just striving, right, for better. And yeah, I also hear, you said you just want to be Wendy, right? So it's also thinking about, what would it be like to just be able to like just be, right, like, and have that be enough, have that just be it, right, just to be Wendy. What about healing?
So I think I've achieved healing in many ways. And, I know that because I get to talk about my past and not cry about it anymore. It took me a very long time to be able to discuss my life, my immigration, or my relationship with my family, or any aspect. And I would cry because it was so hard for me. But now it's been such a long time and I've accepted it. For me, healing percent, like specifically mainly was the fact that I got to forgive myself. And I think a lot of the times my anger came, like I thought my anger came from resentment of everything around me, like my hatred of everything, because I had no control in my life as an undocumented person. But it really, what it was about was that I hated myself for not being able to control my documented status. And I finally was able to say, like, it's not my fault. It's not my fault, and it's no one's fault. It was what it was, and I get to move on. And I think that really healed me a lot of ways. I'm still very much an angry person, but in different ways. But not that way anymore, which was a really big thing in my life. It has pushed me to be a control freak. Like I'm very controlling. I don't like, to the point that to this point, like I don't like drinking sometimes. I don't like, like I never did like weed and stuff because it just freaks me out being out of control. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem too. So it's a lot of stress. I like to be in control. I like to know what I'm doing, where I'm going. What's it called? I like to have a schedule. I like to have a plan. So my older sister is much more like that. So I might say she might be OCD. What's it called? But it's the way we deal with things. But I feel like I have healed a lot emotionally from my past. And in that process, I think I've also acquired things I need to heal from later on. But I'm very happy and very proud to say that I'm able to look back at my past and not be sad about it anymore and sort of understand the life lessons that came from it.
Yeah. And also healing, like, I feel like it's an ongoing, right? So that you can achieve healing in certain aspects, but it's not, like life continues, and it's like, you never know what can happen, and it's not like we're here assuming bad things happen, but it's like certain things may spark something else, right?
Right.
Yeah. I have a few more questions. What about pleasure? Does that come up for you at all when you think of your intersecting Peruvian and queer identities, or how you move through life?
Any type of pleasure, like both physical, emotional. Okay. Pleasure. So when I think about pleasure, I think about, like, I tie it to food and the aspect of like, there is nothing like finding an authentic Peruvian restaurant. Let me tell you. I'll go to a restaurant, and if they have bottled chicha morada, I'll get up and leave. I'll be like, we're not eating here because this is not authentic. And I was like, I found one restaurant in Kendall who was like this little, who they have like a menu, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm on the hunt for a Brower restaurant that supposedly has the menu like a Peruvian traditional for Peruvian prices, which is ridiculous because that's impossible. But they say it exists, so I'm gonna hunt for that. Mm-hmm. But it also means like sharing things and remembering things, and I take really so much pleasure in being able to remember things from my childhood in Peru that I'm remembering as I get older. But also like sometimes I feel bad because supposedly the things that you remember the most are the things that are not as you remember them, because you go back so much, you edit the memories. So I guess things I've forgotten are the most authentic memories of Peru. But I'll remember things, the streets, the places we used to eat, the places we used to hang out with. I think I idolize, and in my own pleasure, whenever I want to feel good, I'll go back to like the most vivid memory I have of my country, of like a Sunday breakfast with my family. It's very like, if you were to play it in a movie, it's very indie, right? It's like we used to have this long table that used to go look through the windows, and my brother was like 2 or 3. And what's it called? My mom was making breakfast. The palta, the guy who sells paltas, is like coming in his bike screaming palta, palta. So he has to go downstairs to get it. We're eating like French bread and we're having coffee. And it's this moment in my mind where it's like, this is happiness, right? Like, this is the only moment I have where like I before, nothing has been sadness, and I know that everything after it will be. So sometimes I take pleasure going back into these memories and just reliving them and being like, we were just children. Like all of us, even my parents in my mind, are children in this mind, because I think they're only 30 and I'm just like kids. When I think about pleasure, I also think about like, it's weird. It's sometimes being a wife, which I thought was really interesting, right? These are like, these roles we're taught not to take, or like in society we're taught like to fight against these societal roles. But sometimes I take pleasure in serving my wife, you know? That's nice. Let me cook for you. What's it called? Or ideas, or like making someone laugh, making someone smile. One of my biggest pleasures is when I lay in my bed and my puppies come and want to cuddle with me, you know? The fact that they want to sleep with me. It's just, like the fact that I bring them peace. And then there's also the more sexual aspects of pleasure, right? Which to me has always been really interesting, because I've never been a very like sexual person. Like I've never understood, like some people who have sex every single day, and that's great for them. Like good for you, live your life. But I've never been that person. And that's also really interesting because me and my sisters have had, me and my older sister have had much more conversations about that aspect and what sex, and you know, like as women who are married and like have these relationships. It also means being able to show pleasure to somebody else and have them pleasure you back. That's really nice. You know, it's also but for me, that's really weird. That's weird. Like, and I don't know what it is about it that I get really uncomfortable about it. Still to this day. I wonder if it's like old Christian guilt, or if it's just like, because it's really weird, right? And don't laugh, but this is something I still have to this day. And like, I don't know if anybody who was a Christian knows what I'm talking about, but it's the fact that it's like, if you're married and you're watching porn for your marriage, is that a sin? Because technically watching porn is a sin, but technically if you're doing it in your marriage, it's not. Right? Is that like or like masturbation, right? If masturbation is a sin, but what if you're doing masturbation as foreplay or sex in your marriage? Is that a sin? That's why I was not liked in Christian school, because I would, in like the kids groups, I would have these questions, not about sex, but I would have these questions about like, because they would say, oh, like if you die right now, you're not believing God, you would go to hell. And I was like, okay, but let's say I was like, you know, what's it called? You believe in God, you're accepting God, but you haven't said it. Like, you know, like you still go to hell at that moment. And so I would play like devil's advocate, because I was like, I don't understand this. I was like, let's give me a blueprint. Let's go like step by step. I was like, what applies here? What applies there? So I still find that really interesting. So if anybody like to, I don't know, you people can't, it's not a podcast. But I was like, I always wanted to know. I was like, am I still sinning? I don't know.
Yeah, I do not know. I mean, I I think that even as you're talking about pleasure, you're naming different aspects of it, right? So I when I ask about pleasure, it's whatever, you know, someone chooses to share, or what that person considers pleasurable. And you know, and you named going back to memories, you named, you know, finding authentic Peruvian restaurants, which is hard to do.
So hard, so hard.
Yeah.
For you, you're UF. At least here in Miami, we have Kendall. The only time if I ever want authentic, I'll drive the hour and 10 minutes down to Kendall to get that good ass food.
Yeah.
I'm like somewhere from here, but it's not the same.
No, I think we just got one Peruvian restaurant, but it's not even fully Peruvian. It just has Peruvian food. And I just don't even want to try it because I'm like, I have a feeling I'm not going to like it.
Like I'm here all for equality and for like mixture of cultures, but like don't bring me your like Cuban, Peruvian, like whatever restaurant you have. If I go to a Peruvian restaurant and in the menu it says like Peruvian food and then Cuban food, I'm like no, because either the chef is really good at Peruvian food or Cuban food, not the same, not both. So I'm sorry. I'm very like, let me tell you, like and I've also made my wife like that. My wife is very like now, like 5 years in, she's like, that's not real Peruvian food. And I'm like, you haven't even gone to Peru. Like, how do you know what's real Peruvian food? But she'd be like, no, that's not it, Wendy. And she's like critiques of people's foods. And I'm just like, who are you? Like 5 years ago, you never even had Peruvian food. You would go to a Peruvian restaurant and you would order like chicken with like steak with fries. I was like, get out of here.
But I mean, it sounds like, you know, you've had an excellent influence in your marriage. But also, you know, like even you naming what it means for you to be in this role, you know, as a wife in your marriage, right? And for that to bring you pleasure, I think it's like, I think that's amazing, right? Because I think that like, at least in Peruvian culture, we are taught that like, you know, it's an act of service always.
Right.
It can't bring you pleasure, right? Because it's like, oh, you're always in this role, you're always having to take care. But I think that forms of care or forms of extending care, right, can be pleasurable for people, right? And like, so I think it's great, right? If doing these acts bringing pleasure in your marriage, right? Like that's beautiful. And even in sex, right? Like I think in all aspects of pleasure, we're constantly navigating what that means. Mm-hmm. In sex as well. And so I value all of the ways that you find pleasure, and I'm glad to hear that you're able to find pleasure in these ways.
Yeah, I find pleasure in it when nobody makes me do it. Like when I'm at a family party, or when I used to go to family parties like 3 years ago before COVID. And like, aren't you going to serve Dorian? And I was like, no. I was like, don't tell me what to do. I was like, but maybe I want to. If I want to, it's okay. But now you said that I have to, I don't want to do it anymore.
That's real. I have 2 more questions before we wrap.
Okay.
One is, what do you wish for yourself?
That's weird. That's weird to define. Because there's like, I don't know, and it's because I always go back to that idea, right? I've gotten better at it, nor because I am more comfortable in it. But what I'm trying to define is the fact that like, I always feel like I'm living 3 lives or like multiple lives, because I always feel like I want to be different people at the exact same time. I think like everyone does, right? But it's so much more convoluted when you have like these fractions in your life with immigration, identity, and everything. And so I've done many things in my life. Like I'm 27 and I've held many jobs because I've always wanted to be like, what the fuck? Like I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do this. And sometimes I add too much to my plate. So I think what I want for my life, I want stability. I think that's the key. And when we have stability, hopefully it comes with wealth. Because I feel like in one of the things that I think people of color can do to combat a lot of their issues is having wealth. Because sometimes people will accept you more if you have money. And that's just the realistic of the things we have. But I think most of all, I really want to have a deeper connection with my culture. So I want for my life, for my future to be like, for example, I'm trying to do a Pachamanga, what's it called, event at the end of the month, but I'm also like anxious about it because like me and Rob have never done one, so we're literally learning from like videos and also like things we've heard about it, and I'm just like, okay. And so that's also interesting, right? Like it feels like you're the first person to ever do this when like in your family generations and generations of people have done this, but to you it's brand new because someone's taught you, because we don't do that here. Um, so it's being connected to my culture, to my language. To keep up with Quechua, I've started to translate Alexander Hamilton, the play, in Quechua, just so I can, like on a break, I can be like, okay, this is what these words would mean in Quechua, and just so I can keep it in my head. Because if not, you don't practice it, right? What's it called? I want stability, I want wealth, I want to hopefully get into law school, but most importantly, I want to be happy. I was like, I think a lot of my life, I define things with things I acquire, right? With a job, health, or like money, and like. But I think I've realized throughout the years that those things, as much as they bring a moments of empowerment, of moments of like I did it, I succeeded, they're not fully happiness. They're just enough to keep me at bay until I'm like, okay, I need to do something else. I don't know what it's like to be perpetually happy. I hope to one day achieve it. What's it called? And so I hope to be with my wife and my puppies and some top law school. I'll settle for a top 20, but just a good school, and be happy, and be stable, and in a lot of ways be able to have stability and have wealth to give it back. I think I told Dorian, I was like, I want to be rich because I want to give it back. I was like, how different would our perspective be of these wealthy people if they gave more of it back? Like, I'll be like, keep being wealthy if you're just gonna keep sharing it around. Because like I told Dorian, I was like, what's the point? What's the point of having everything if you're there by yourself and you look around and there's no one else with you or anyone else that looks like you? And then there's no point, because then you're alone. And the whole point of working hard is not for yourself. It's so that I can open the doors and help others get up there. And I think my whole life I've lived through that. Sometimes to a point of like fault, because it is a lot of work and it is a lot of stressful. But I try, like now, for example, when I'm not part of the movement, I try to help monetarily, right? Like someone needs some money, someone needs to get out of jail, someone's going out with ICE, someone needs help for a lawyer. I can help that way. And I think that's also a form of activism, a form of help that a lot of people need in this time period. So I'm just hoping that I can be happy, make my family happy, and make others happy.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And like the best of luck in getting into law school. Like, know that there's gonna be someone out here who's like manifesting for you, right? Like all of these things that you have named, right? I think even in naming them, there's a really radical potential in there, right? Like you're naming them, you know that you're putting the work into all of these different things, right? And so even in wishing all of these for yourself, right? Like I wish them as well. I wish them for you. And so my last question, what about for queer Peruvians? What do you wish for them?
I wish for them to be heard and seen. I wish for them to have power, whether that be in the small aspects of their lives or big in government. It's something to say here, like I want queer people in power, I want queer people to have these spaces, but people don't even have laws and like in any type of bill in Peru. That's non-existent. So maybe we'll start there. Like I want queer people to be their authentic self, to be able to have backings of a government, backings of community, of society, to be accepted, to be able to live their lives regardless. And most importantly, I think for all of Peru, I want people to have the conversations they're afraid to have, because as a country, we can't move forward until we have these conversations and understand them. And I know that because of how you can see it here in the small minority of Peruvians that exist here, and how even when like you group a group of Peruvians who've never known each other, they can still have these sort of really emotional conversations about things that maybe didn't happen to us personally, maybe to our parents or our grandparents. But if we don't have them, we won't know. We won't acknowledge them, right? The fact that things still get covered up is ridiculous. And so I want for queer Peruvians to be included in conversations, to be accepted, to be, have some backing of safety, and most importantly, to be able to just exist, just for existing. People don't have to give you a reason to exist; they just do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Wendolyn, for sharing all of that with me. I'm really grateful that you took time out of your day to talk to me, to share so much. I really don't take it lightly. Like, I wouldn't be able to do any of this if it wasn't for folks who have reached out, right? If it wasn't for the trust that just that folks put in me as we're having these conversations. Like, I really don't take it lightly. So thank you so much for all of what you've shared, for your labor in telling me your story. Is there anything else you wish to share with me before we wrap?
I think it's about everything in summation of my whole story in a weird way. It's really interesting to sort of see your story like in different perspectives. But I really wanted to thank you because I think, first of all, Peruvian people are really represented in a lot of the conversations. And most importantly, because people don't really talk about queer Peruvians. I think queerness in Latin America is sort of really comicalized, I think, because of the way it's portrayed in the United States, right? And so I want to thank you for creating that space and allowing us to be able to have these conversations and sort of be able to rant to you and be like, here, let me tell you my life story about being queer and Peruvian. And I'm really excited to actually hear all these as well, because it's really interesting to see the different perspectives, right? Like, from people from different backgrounds, different locations, their connections, because I was very fortunate to live surrounded by Peruvian people, even though I felt like an outlier. But I'm pretty sure there are people who live in the middle of other states who they don't have a big Peruvian community. So that'll be really interesting to see. And the interactions, the definitions, it's different. Every Peruvian is different, and queerness is defined differently by every person. But I want to thank you so much for that space. I'm so excited. I can't wait to see how this all turns out.
Yeah, thank you. It's been such a joy, like, honestly, like a gift to like bear witness to people's stories, because you're right, there's no singular Peruvian, right? And every single person that has shared with me, all of the other folks that will be sharing with me, like I really am grateful, and I continue to say in gratitude, for the community that forms, as we keep sharing these stories. So if there's nothing else that you want to share, I can go ahead and stop the recording.